and look forward to the contribution to the member for Hughes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's pleased to follow the member for Whitlam, channeling Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn down there at the dispatch box, ranting on about all those good, hard socialist policies, Deputy Speaker. But the one thing we see time and time again from Labor spokesmen on the economy, and why they always get it wrong, Deputy Speaker, they think the size of the economy, the size of the economic pie is fixed. They don't understand that the size of our economic pie, the total wealth created in the economy, can grow and shrink. And the problem is, which they don't understand, is every time that you step in and you try and redistribute the wealth, you destroy the very incentives to create that wealth in the first place. And this is why we see policy after policy from the Labor side fail, Deputy Speaker. And the member for Whitlam talks about wage increases from tax cuts. Well, I think the member for Whitlam should actually go and read a few things about what's happening in the USA, because they have reduced their corporate rate of tax, Deputy Speaker. And what's happened? Millions upon millions of workers in the USA are receiving pay increases. Many of them are receiving $1,000 cash bonuses from their employees. That is what is happening. That is the evidence of what is happening when you reduce the corporate rate of tax. And if we go back in our nation's history, we look at every single time we have reduced the rate of corporate tax. We reduced the percentage rate. Do you know what's happened, Deputy Speaker? Without fail, every time we have ended up not only with more tax revenue, but we've ended up with more corporate tax as a percentage of GDP at a lower rate of tax. So we've not only grown the pie, but we've ended up with a bigger slice of that bigger pie in taxation revenue. Now, no one knows, no one can guarantee that will be exactly what happens in the future. But we've seen it every time in our nation. We've seen it recently in New Zealand, where their Conservative government lowered the rate of corporate tax, Deputy Speaker, and what happened in New Zealand? Wages rose, revenue rose, and the government ended up with more revenue, not less. Everything tells us, Deputy Speaker, that the same will happen here again in Australia. We've also heard the member for Whitlam rant on about electricity prices, and it's so timely that the member for Port Adelaide is in the chamber at this time. Because, Deputy Speaker, in life, there's a thing that you do as a young child you learn. If you put your hand in the fire, you get burnt. You don't put your hand in the fire again. And the way we progress, whether it's in business or any, it's a society, even as a species, is a series of small-scale experiments where we try something a little bit different. If it fails, we stop immediately and go down another track. If it works, we duplicate it and we roll it out. Now, Deputy Speaker, there has been a thought that a 50% renewable energy target, or should I correctly say, a 50% compulsory forced government mandate for the generation of intermittent and unreliable energy, Deputy Speaker, there has been a thought upon that it would actually lower the price of electricity. That's what many theorists thought. And, Deputy Speaker, that's fair enough. If you're thinking about a new idea, it's good that people put their different views and opinions forward. Now, we've seen this experiment conducted before our very eyes in South Australia. We've seen the experiment conducted about having a 50% renewable energy target. And, Deputy Speaker, it has ended up in tears. Probably one of the greatest policy failures in our nation's history at any level. It has delivered that state not only the most unreliable energy, forcing them to spend $500 million in a state of 1.7 million people having to spend $500 million in a desperate attempt to keep the lights on, bringing in emergency diesel generators to have them on standby. Not only that, on top of that, it has delivered that state the highest electricity prices anywhere in the world. Now, common sense would tell you, Deputy Speaker, if you've tried that experiment and it has been an unmitigated disaster, that you'd say, yes, we failed, you'd pull back and you'd go down another track. That's how we progress. So I said, if you put your hand in the fire and you get burnt, you learn as a young child that you don't do it. But yet, Deputy Speaker, we're seeing the Labor Party look at South Australia and say, well, let's copy it. Let's copy the 50% renewable energy target and let's take it nationwide. This is insane. This is complete nuts. And yet, this is the Labor Party's policy on energy. To copy an unmitigated disaster, to copy a failed experiment that will see pensioners in this nation being unable to heat their homes in winter, to turn air conditioning into a luxury good, to have businesses that are no longer viable in this nation and forced to move offshore because of the high cost of energy in this nation. That is what the Labor Party wants to copy. And I call on good members of the Labor Party, speak up in your party room. Put aside trying to attract a handful of green inner city votes. Think of the pensioners, the workers, the coal miners that the Labor Party used to stand up for. The Ben Chifleys of this world that would look upon a Labor policy that pushed electricity prices up and be rolling in his grave today if he saw the plans of what they did, about how they were selling out the pensioners, selling out the workers of this country just to attract a few inner city green votes. Speaker, in the time left on this appropriations bill, I'd quickly like to raise the issue of electric cars. Now, there's been quite a bit of debate about this recently in the media. In fact, even the chief scientist has chipped into the debate and taken the role of chief subsidy seeker in an article he wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald the other week. And the chief scientist gets it wrong in many respects. The first place he gets it wrong is the debate is not for or against electric cars. It's not trying to have an argument against electric cars. The argument is, or the debate is, should electric cars be subsidised in Australia? That's what the debate is about. Now, I think take a pretty simple proposition. If electric cars are so great, and they certainly are, have many wonderful benefits, I'm the first to acknowledge that. But if they are so great, why do they need a subsidy? Why do you need a subsidy if they are such great? It should be our job in government should be to level the playing field between the technologies, let them compete against each other as vigorously as they possibly can to put the best offer that they can towards the consumer, and let the consumer decide. We shouldn't suppose that we know better down here in Canberra what the consumer should buy in a car. We should just level the playing field and let the consumer decide. But we already have a substantial range of subsidies for electric cars in this country. We have subsidised finance. We have the fact that electric cars make no contribution to the fuel excise. We have a luxury car tax break. We have subsidised registrations and stamp duty. There's subsidised charging, Deputy Speaker. We have a tax office ruling that allows very generous deductions. Now, the argument that's put forward for these subsidies, and more subsidies that the electric car industry is asking for, Deputy Speaker, is the argument they say that it will lower emissions, that is good for the environment. Now, to take the words of the chief scientist, we should test this hypothesis with the evidence. And we can look at the evidence, Deputy Speaker, because we can actually use the science and the maths to make a calculation of the grams of carbon dioxide emitted per kilometre travelled. That is something that we can do. And in fact, we do that with a green government vehicle. It's a green vehicle guide that the government puts out, Deputy Speaker. Now, this is very handy. It does a good job, but it does, unfortunately, leave out a few things. It leaves out, Deputy Speaker, in their calculations, it doesn't make any allowance for the losses for the transmission and distribution for electricity. That should add extra 10% on to the CO2 emissions of electric cars. It also makes no allowance for the fact that there are substantial higher manufacturing emissions from electric cars. That's just not my supposition. That's from a study titled Comparative Environmental Life Cycle Assessment of Conventional Electric Vehicles, published in the Journal of Industrial Ecology, where the authors estimated the emissions from electric vehicles produced between 87 to 95 grams of CO2 per kilometre, compared to 44 grams of CO2 associated with a standard petrol or diesel car engine. The other thing it fails to look at, Deputy Speaker, is that when you charge your car from the grid, mostly you'll charge it at night. And the carbon intensity of our grids, especially in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, is substantially higher at night. For example, the last few nights, Deputy Speaker, at night time in New South Wales, 99% of the electricity has come from coal. Because we know that our hydro plants and our gas plants in New South Wales are used as peaking plants. Of course, we have no solar at night. Also, Deputy Speaker, it makes no allowance for the fact that when you turn the heater on in an electric car, you use substantially more energy than you do in a petrol car. The reason is, Deputy Speaker, that the petrol car, the heat in your heater in winter actually comes from the passenger engine. As we're in an electric car, it is almost a pure electric heater. Now, when you factor all those things in, there is simply no case for subsidies for electric cars in this nation. The CO2 emissions, almost on a like-for-like basis, Deputy Speaker, are higher in almost every circumstance. Even the good old Toyota Corolla, our most popular selling car, Deputy Speaker, has lower emissions than a Tesla. And I know the chief scientist talks in his article. He says, oh yes, but there's the Renault Zoe, which only emits 121 grams per kilometre. But he, again, forgetting all those other things, but what he doesn't look at, Renault actually have another vehicle called the Megane, which is a petrol diesel car, Deputy Speaker, which has lower CO2 emissions at 115 grams of CO2 per kilometre driven. Deputy Speaker, and then we look to the future. We're often told, Deputy Speaker, that the future will be all electric. Well, earlier this week, we had the publication of the Annual Energy Outlook for 2018 of the US Energy Information Administration. And it makes projections out to 2050, Deputy Speaker. Now, to 2050 is the middle of this century. And what they predict, Deputy Speaker, that plug-in electric vehicles in the US by 2050 will only make up 14% of the US passenger car fleet. Over 80% of the vehicles, I'm happy, I hear the member for Port Adelaide, obviously he is uninformed in this case, and I'm happy to send it to him. This is from none other than the US Energy Information Administration. That is their projections, for the latest projections out to 2050. That is what they project. Now, you may have other projections, you may have other information, or you just be making it up, like you've previously done. And I notice the other member there for Grainless sitting at the table is another culprit in this. The two gentlemen sitting there at the table, they have gone on and talked about how thermal coal is in rapid decline. Well, I hope they've looked at the evidence over the last 12 months and seen that we've had record exports of coal. Both of you sitting down there have stood up in the media and made ridiculous comments about the decline of exports of thermal coal. And yet, Deputy Speaker, we have had the largest increase in coal exports in our nation's history. everywhere around the world. Japan is importing more thermal coal. China's coal consumption last year was up 5.2%. Deputy Speaker, I'll leave my remarks there, and I'd be more than happy at any time to give the two gentlemen at the sitting table a briefing so they can not make so many silly comments in the media and embarrass themselves.